What if the first kings of humanity didn't rule for decades but for millennia? What if the ancient world remembers a time when immortal rulers watched over cities for tens of thousands of years, only to see their endless reigns swept away by waters that drowned the world? In the dusty archives of the British Museum, carved into a clay prism smaller than a loaf of bread, lies one of archaeology's most bewildering documents. The Sumerian King List speaks of rulers who governed for impossibly vast stretches of time: 43,000 years, 36,000 years, 28,000 years, as if time itself moved differently in the world before the Great Flood came to reset everything. So before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to histories where myth and memory blur into something stranger than fiction. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this ancient knowledge stretching across the world, connecting us all in the dark. Tonight, we'll follow the trail of kings whose names were already legend when writing was young, whose impossible lifespans challenge everything we think we know about the dawn of civilization. Because sometimes the most fantastic stories carry the deepest truths, and sometimes the line between history and myth isn't a boundary. It's an invitation to remember what we've forgotten about the world before the waters came. In 1918, German archaeologist Hermann Hilprecht held in his hands a triangular clay prism, its surface dense with cuneiform script that seemed to defy rational explanation. This wasn't just another administrative record from ancient Mesopotamia. This was a document that claimed to preserve the names and reign lengths of every king who had ever ruled Sumer, stretching back to the very beginning of time itself, when kingship first descended from heaven to earth. The prism itself was deceptively small, no larger than a modern hardcover book, yet its weight seemed to carry the accumulated centuries of human memory. Hilprecht, working by lamplight in his study at the University of Pennsylvania, traced his finger along the wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay when the world was young. Each cuneiform sign had been carefully inscribed by a scribe whose own civilization was already ancient, when Rome was nothing but marshland along the Tiber. The clay bore the patina of ages, a deep brown surface crossed with hairline cracks that spoke of its journey through time, buried beneath layers of sand and rubble for millennia before emerging into the electric light of the modern world. But it was the content of those cuneiform marks that made Hilprecht's hands tremble as he worked through the translation. Line by line, the text revealed itself to be something unprecedented in archaeological discovery, a complete genealogy of kingship stretching back, not centuries, but tens of thousands of years. The scribe who created this record claimed to be preserving the names of rulers whose reigns began when civilization itself was young, when the gods still walked among mortals and time moved to rhythms we can barely comprehend. The document has been purchased from antiquities dealers operating in southern Iraq, where local diggers had been systematically looting ancient sites for decades. Its exact provenance remained mysterious, somewhere in the ruins of ancient Larsa perhaps, or in the tells that dotted the landscape between the Tigris and Euphrates like sleeping giants. The clay itself bore the mineral signature of Mesopotamian river mud, mixed with the chopped straw that ancient potters used to strengthen their work against cracking. Carbon dating would later confirm its antiquity, placing its creation sometime around 2000 BCE, making it a copy of records that were already ancient when Babylon was at its height. What troubled Hilprecht most was the precision with which the impossible was recorded. These weren't vague mythological claims or poetic exaggerations. The scribe had listed each king's name, the city where he ruled, and the exact number of years he held power, all with the methodical care of a modern historian. 43,200 years, 36,000 years, 28,800 years. The numbers were specific, calculated, preserved with the same bureaucratic attention to detail that characterized Mesopotamian record-keeping for grain stores and tax collections. Yet something deeper than mere numbers seemed to whisper from those ancient marks in clay. The document spoke of a time when the boundary between mortal and divine was fluid, when kings ruled not by conquest or inheritance, but by some cosmic appointment that stretched their reigns across geological epochs. This wasn't just a king list. It was a window into a worldview where time itself operated according to different laws, where human life possessed a scope and scale that defied everything archaeology had taught about the ancient world. The King List begins with words that echo like a creation myth. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. But what did those ancient scribes mean when they spoke of kingship descending? Archaeological evidence from Eridu, the world's oldest city, reveals layers of habitation stretching back 7,000 years. Yet the King List speaks of rulers whose reigns began in a time that exists somewhere between history and eternity. To understand what the ancient scribes meant by kingship descending from heaven, you must imagine standing in the ruins of Eridu today, where wind-carved tells rise from the desert like monuments to forgotten time. Here, in what is now southern Iraq, the first human settlement took root beside the sweet waters of the Persian Gulf, when the world was younger and the climate kinder. The Sumerians themselves believed Eridu to be the very first city ever built, the place where civilization began when the gods decided that humanity was ready to move beyond the nomadic life of hunters and gatherers. But the phrase, descended from heaven, carries implications that stretch beyond simple mythology. In Sumerian cosmology, heaven wasn't a distant realm but a kind of cosmic government, a divine bureaucracy that managed the affairs of earth through appointed representatives. When the scribes wrote that kingship descended, they weren't describing a metaphorical appointment. They were documenting what they believed to be a literal transfer of authority from celestial beings to earthly rulers. The first kings weren't men who seized power or inherited it from human fathers. They were selected, appointed, given their authority by forces that existed beyond the normal boundaries of mortal existence. Archaeological excavations at Eridu have revealed layer upon layer of continuous occupation, with the earlier settlements dating back to approximately 5,800 BCE. Sir Leonard Woolley's expeditions in the 1920s uncovered temple foundations built upon earlier temple foundations, creating a vertical timeline of worship that stretched back through the millennia. Each rebuilding preserved the footprint of what came before, as if the later inhabitants were following a sacred blueprint that could never be altered, only renewed. What emerges from the excavated layers is a picture of remarkable cultural continuity. The pottery styles change gradually across the centuries, but the basic pattern of life, the layout of houses, the design of temples, the organization of the settlement, remains consistent across thousands of years. It's as if the first inhabitants established a way of life so perfect, so divinely ordained, that their descendants dared not alter it fundamentally. This wasn't evolution or development. This was faithful reproduction of an original pattern handed down from the beginning. Yet the King List claims that this continuity stretched across timescales that archaeology cannot verify. If Alulim truly ruled Eridu for 28,800 years, his reign would have begun long before the earliest archaeological evidence of settlement at the site. The mathematics create a temporal puzzle that challenges our understanding of both Mesopotamian chronology and human history itself. Either the scribes were preserving symbolic rather than literal time, or they were remembering a form of rulership that operated according to principles we no longer understand. The cuneiform text offers no explanation for how such extended reigns were possible, presenting the impossible lifespans with the same matter-of-fact precision used for recording the delivery of barley or the construction of irrigation canals. To the ancient scribes, apparently, there was nothing inherently unbelievable about kings who ruled for geological epochs. They lived in a world where the boundaries between human and divine, natural and supernatural were more fluid than our modern categories allow. According to the clay tablets, the very first king of humanity was named Alulim, and he ruled the sacred city of Eridu for 28,800 years. Imagine a single man watching over the same streets, the same temples, the same families for nearly 300 centuries, longer than all of recorded history, longer than the rise and fall of every civilization we know. To grasp the enormity of Alulim's supposed reign, consider what 28,800 years actually encompasses. If such a timeline were literal, this single king would have witnessed the retreat of the last ice age, the invention of agriculture, the domestication of animals, the development of pottery, the discovery of metalworking, and the first tentative experiments in urban living. He would have ruled when mammoths still roamed the earth, when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than today, when the Persian Gulf was dry land crossed by rivers whose names are now forgotten. During those endless millennia, if we follow the King List's chronology, Alulim would have watched his city grow from a collection of reed huts beside a riverbank to the sophisticated urban centre that archaeologists have uncovered. He would have overseen the construction and reconstruction of temples, each new version built directly atop its predecessor in the ancient Mesopotamian tradition of sacred continuity. The temple complex at Eridu shows evidence of at least 17 rebuilding phases, each one preserving the exact footprint and orientation of what came before. What kind of consciousness could encompass such vast stretches of time? In 28,800 years, 1,000 generations of ordinary humans would be born, live their brief lives, and return to dust. Yet Alulim supposedly maintained unbroken awareness across all those centuries, making decisions, rendering judgments, guiding the development of civilization with the patience of geological processes. The very concept challenges our understanding of what it means to be human, to experience time, to hold memory and identity across the decades. Perhaps the scribes who preserved Alulim's story understood something about consciousness and time that we've forgotten. In their worldview, the first kings weren't fully human in our modern sense. They were something between mortal and divine, possessing aspects of both earthly and heavenly nature. Their extended lifespans weren't anomalies requiring explanation, but natural expressions of their dual nature. their role as bridges between the realm of the gods and the world of humanity. The name Alulim itself carries meanings that hint at his unique status. In Sumerian, the component suggests stag, or leader of the deer, connecting him to the wild abundance of the pre-agricultural world, yet also implying mastery over nature rather than subjugation to it. Some scholars interpret the name as meaning the one who leads from the past, suggesting that Alulim's primary function was as a keeper of ancient knowledge, a living repository of wisdom accumulated across impossible spans of time. If Alulim was indeed the first king, his reign would have established all the precedents by which later rulers would be judged. Every law, every ritual, every tradition of kingship would trace its origin back to decisions made during those 28,800 years. In a very real sense, he wouldn't just have been ruling Eridu, he would have been creating the very concept of rule itself, defining what it meant for a human being to hold authority over other human beings by divine appointment. The archaeological record from Eridu shows clear evidence of increasing social complexity over time, with larger buildings, more elaborate burials, and more sophisticated pottery pointing toward the development of hierarchical society. Yet the King List suggests this hierarchy didn't evolve gradually, but was established fully formed from the beginning, when kingship first descended from heaven and settled upon the first chosen ruler of the first city ever built. Before the great flood swept the world clean, 8 kings ruled the cities of Sumer with lifespans that stretch credibility beyond breaking. Alaljar governed Bad Tibera for 36,000 years. Enmenluanna held power in Sippar for 43,200 years. Each name preserved in cuneiform carries the weight of geological time, as if these weren't mortal men, but something closer to forces of nature. The mathematical precision with which these impossible reigns are recorded suggests that the ancient scribes weren't engaging in poetic exaggeration, but preserving what they believed to be literal historical truth. Enmenluanna ruled Sippar for 21,000 years. Dumuzi of Bad Tibera held power for 36,000 years. Ubaratutu, the final antediluvian king, governed Shuruppak for 18,600 years. When added together, the combined reigns of these 8 rulers span 241,200 years, a chronology that reaches back into the Pleistocene epoch, when ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere and sea level stood hundreds of feet lower than today. Each of these kings ruled a different city, suggesting that the antediluvian world was organized not as a unified empire but as a collection of independent city-states, each governed by its own immortal ruler. Yet the King List presents their reigns as sequential rather than overlapping, implying some kind of rotating supreme authority that passed from city to city according to divine will rather than human ambition. This wasn't conquest or inheritance in any recognizable sense. It was a cosmic appointment system that operated according to celestial rather than terrestrial logic. The cities themselves reveal the weight of this ancient authority. Bad Tibera, where both Alaljar and Dumuzi ruled for their impossible spans, has been tentatively identified with modern Tel Eder in Iraq. Archaeological surveys of the site reveal occupation layers stretching back to the earliest Neolithic period, with evidence of sophisticated urban planning and monumental architecture that speaks to the organization of vast human resources over extended periods. Similarly, Sippar, the city of Enmenluanna and Enmenluanna, was known throughout Mesopotamian history as a center of learning and solar worship, home to libraries and schools that preserved ancient knowledge across millennia. What strikes modern readers most forcefully about these antediluvian reigns is their sheer scale. A king who rules for 43,000 years isn't just governing, he's shepherding the entire development of human civilization. He would oversee the transition from stone tools to copper tools to bronze tools. He would watch the invention of writing, the development of mathematics, the establishment of law codes, the creation of the first literature. Such a ruler wouldn't just be a political leader, but a living repository of all human knowledge, a consciousness that contained within itself the entire history of technological and cultural progress. Yet the King List offers no explanation for how such extended lifespans were possible, no account of special divine gifts or magical interventions. The impossible ages are simply stated as fact, recorded with the same clerical precision used for documenting the construction of temples or the distribution of grain rations. To the scribes who preserved these records, apparently, there was nothing inherently miraculous about kings who ruled for epochs. This was simply how things had been in the time before the flood, when the world operated according to different principles and human life possessed a scope and grandeur that later ages could barely comprehend. Some scholars have suggested that these vast numbers might encode astronomical cycles rather than literal lifespans, with each year of kingly rule representing not a solar year but some larger temporal unit, perhaps a precessional cycle, or a calculation based on planetary movements. Others propose that the antediluvian kings weren't individuals but dynasties, with each reign representing the combined rule of multiple generations bearing the same name and title. Yet the text itself offers no hint that the numbers should be interpreted symbolically, presenting the lifespans with straightforward literalism that either preserves genuine historical memory or represents a form of record-keeping we no longer understand. Eridu, Badibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak. These weren't just ancient cities. They were the first places where humans gathered under the rule of kings, where civilization took its earliest breath. Archaeological excavations reveal that some of these sites show continuous habitations stretching back to the very dawn of farming. Yet the King List speaks of them as seats of power in an age when time itself moved to a different rhythm. Walking through the ruins of these primordial cities today, you can still feel the weight of their antiquity pressing up through layers of sand and broken pottery. At Eridu, the remains of temple platforms rise from the desert floor like artificial mountains, each level representing centuries of careful rebuilding. The ancient Sumerians believed that temples once consecrated could never truly die. They could only be renewed, rebuilt upon the same sacred ground according to the same divine blueprints handed down from the beginning of time. Sippar, the city of the sun god Shamash, has yielded thousands of cuneiform tablets that reveal its role as a center of learning throughout Mesopotamian history. The temple complex there housed one of the ancient world's great libraries, where scribes copied and preserved texts that were already ancient when Hammurabi was king. Among these preserved documents are astronomical observations stretching back thousands of years, mathematical calculations of stunning precision, and literary works that form the foundation of human storytelling. If Enmenluanna truly ruled this city for 43,000 years, he would have overseen not just the invention of writing, but its development into sophisticated forms of literature and science. Badibira, the fortress of the metalworkers, was apparently the centre of ancient metallurgy, the place where humans first learned to shape copper and tin into tools and weapons that would transform their relationship with the natural world. Archaeological evidence from the region shows that metalworking began surprisingly early in Mesopotamian history, with sophisticated techniques appearing almost simultaneously with the first urban settlements. The King Lists claim that immortal rulers governed these cities during their foundational periods suggest that the development of civilization wasn't gradual but guided, directed by consciousnesses that possessed the patience and wisdom accumulated across geological time spans. Shuruppak, the city of the final antediluvian king, holds special significance as the home of Utnapishtim, the flood hero whose story was later echoed in the biblical account of Noah. Excavations at the site, identified with modern Telfara, have revealed clear evidence of flood damage in the archaeological layers, with water-deposited silt interrupting the normal sequence of human habitation. Here, perhaps more than anywhere else, the King List intersects with both archaeology and mythology, preserving the memory of rulers whose impossible reigns ended when the Great Deluge swept across the world. The continuity revealed by archaeological investigation of these sites is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their ancient history. At Eridu, 17 successive temple rebuildings preserve exactly the same orientation, the same basic floor plan, the same relationship to the surrounding urban space. This wasn't accident or coincidence. It was deliberate preservation of an original pattern that the builders considered too sacred to alter. Such consistency across millennia suggests a form of cultural transmission that transcended normal human memory, as if the essential knowledge needed to maintain civilization was embedded so deeply in the communities that it survived every catastrophe, every change of dynasty, every transformation of language and custom. Modern excavations have revealed that several of these antediluvian cities show evidence of sudden dramatic flooding, followed by periods of abandonment and then careful rebuilding according to pre-flood patterns. The flood layers at Kish, and Shuruppak all date to approximately the same period, around 3000 BCE, suggesting that the Great Deluge remembered in the King List wasn't mythological but historical, a real catastrophe that separated the antediluvian age from the more familiar world of ordinary human lifespans. What emerges from both the textual evidence of the King List and the archaeological evidence from these ancient sites is a picture of civilization that challenges our assumptions about human development. Instead of gradual progress from primitive beginnings, we see sophisticated urban centers appearing almost fully formed, governed according to principles that suggest continuity with an even more ancient past. The impossible kings with their geological lifespans weren't legendary figures projected backward onto prehistoric darkness. They were the institutional memory of these cities made manifest, the living embodiment of accumulated wisdom that guided human society through its earliest and most crucial phases of development. As the Great Flood approached, gathering strength in the cosmic cycles that governed the antediluvian world, these ancient cities and their immortal rulers faced the end of an age that had lasted longer than all subsequent history combined. But that is a story for the darkness ahead, when the waters would rise and the world would begin again, measured not in epochs, but in the brief spans of mortal years. Then the flood came, not as metaphor or myth, but as the great dividing line that separated one age of the world from another. The King List states it simply. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when the kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Everything before was prologue. everything after would be measured in human years, human lifespans, human understanding of time's limitations. The ancient scribes devoted no elaborate description to this cosmic catastrophe, no epic poetry to capture its magnitude. Where later literature would craft detailed narratives of rising waters and divine wrath, the King List offers only stark documentation, bureaucratic notation marking the end of one world and the beginning of another. Yet that very brevity suggests something profound about how the flood was understood by those who preserved its memory. This wasn't a story requiring embellishment or explanation. It was simply what happened, as inevitable and final as sunset, dividing all of history into before and after. Imagine the waters rising across the Mesopotamian plain, creeping at first through reed marshes and irrigation channels before gaining momentum and force. The cuneiform texts speak of rain that fell for 7 days and 7 nights without ceasing, but also of waters that came from beneath, underground channels and aquifers bursting forth as if the earth itself had opened to release the accumulated moisture of ages. The flood wasn't merely meteorological but geological, a reshaping of the very foundations upon which the antediluvian cities had stood. In those final moments before the waters claimed their ancient thrones, what did the immortal kings of Sumer think as they watched the approaching deluge? Alulim, who had ruled Eridu for 28,800 years, would have seen countless seasonal floods come and go, watch the Tigris and Euphrates overflow their banks in the natural cycles that brought fertility to the land. But this was different. This was the unwinding of cosmic order itself, the end of the age when gods walked among mortals and time flowed like honey through endless summers. The King List suggests that the flood wasn't punishment but transition, not divine wrath, but cosmic necessity. Just as day must give way to night and season must follow season, so the antediluvian age had to end to make way for a new form of human existence. The impossibly long reigns of the first kings weren't sustainable indefinitely. Even immortality, it seems, had its appointed seasons. The flood served as the Great Reset, clearing away the accumulated weight of geological time to make space for a more human scale of existence. Yet something essential survived that watery catastrophe. When the King List records that kingship was lowered from heaven after the flood, it suggests that the principle of divine rule wasn't destroyed but transformed. The same cosmic authority that had appointed Alulim to rule Eridu for nearly 30,000 years continued to operate in the post-flood world, but within the more modest boundaries appropriate to mortal life. The gods hadn't abandoned humanity. They had simply adjusted their expectations to match a new reality, where kings would measure their reigns in decades rather than millennia. The waters that swept away the antediluvian world carried with them not just cities and populations, but an entire way of being human. When they finally receded, leaving behind layers of silt and the scattered remnants of the world that was, humanity faced the task of rebuilding civilization according to new principles, new limitations, new relationships between the mortal and divine realms. In the 1920s, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating the royal cemetery at when his workers struck an unusual layer, 11 feet of clean water-deposited silt with no trace of human habitation. Below this sterile flood layer lay the remains of an earlier civilization. Above it, a new world began. Similar flood layers have been discovered at sites across Mesopotamia, each one a silent witness to waters that rose high enough to bury entire cities. Woolley's discovery sent ripples of excitement through the archaeological community, not merely because it provided physical evidence for the biblical flood narrative, but because it revealed the sheer scale of the catastrophe that had swept across ancient Mesopotamia. 11 feet of sterile silt doesn't accumulate gradually. It represents a sudden, massive inundation that buried everything beneath it under waters deep enough to suspend and deposit fine particles across vast areas. The thickness and uniformity of the layer spoke of waters that had covered the entire Mesopotamian plain, transforming it temporarily into an inland sea. But what fascinated Woolley most was what lay beneath that flood stratum. The pre-flood civilization revealed by his excavations was sophisticated and well established, with fine pottery, elaborate grave goods, and evidence of complex social organization. These weren't primitive people caught by rising waters. These were the inheritors of a mature culture that had developed over many centuries. Their sudden burial beneath the flood layer suggested not gradual decline but abrupt termination, as if an entire way of life had been swept away in a single catastrophic event. The pottery beneath Woolley's flood layer was distinctive, painted ceramics of exceptional quality that showed clear, stylistic evolution over time. Above the flood layer, pottery styles were completely different, as if the new inhabitants who reoccupied the site after the waters receded came from a different cultural tradition entirely. This wasn't simple continuity interrupted by natural disaster. This was civilizational replacement on a massive scale. Other archaeological expeditions across Mesopotamia began reporting similar flood layers at roughly the same stratigraphic levels. At Kish, archaeologist Stephen Langdon uncovered an 18-inch layer of flood silt, separating earlier occupation levels from later ones. At Shuruppak, German excavators found clear evidence of catastrophic flooding that had interrupted the normal sequence of human habitation. At Nineveh, similar water-deposited layers marked a break in the archaeological record that corresponded roughly to the same time period. The dating of these flood layers, based on pottery styles and stratigraphic analysis, suggested they all belonged to approximately the same period, somewhere around 3000 to 2800 BCE. This wasn't a series of separate local floods, but evidence of a single, massive inundation that had affected the entire region simultaneously. The archaeological evidence was confirming what the ancient King List had preserved in its stark notation. The flood had been real, regional in scope, and catastrophic in its effects. Yet the flood layers also revealed something remarkable about human resilience and cultural transmission. While the catastrophe had clearly caused massive disruption and population displacement, the cities were eventually reoccupied and rebuilt. The new inhabitants didn't simply start from scratch. They rebuilt temples on the same sacred spots, re-established trade routes along the same paths, and resumed the patterns of urban life that had characterized Mesopotamian civilization before the flood. Somehow, the essential knowledge needed to maintain complex society had survived the watery catastrophe and been passed on to the rebuilders. Modern geological surveys have identified ancient river channels and deltic deposits that support the archaeological evidence for massive flooding in early Mesopotamian history. Core samples from the Persian Gulf reveal sediment layers that correspond to periods of dramatically increased freshwater input, suggesting that the Tigris and Euphrates had indeed carried enormous volumes of floodwater to the sea during the late 4th millennium BCE. The flood recorded in the King List and preserved in archaeological layers wasn't mythological but geological, a real event that had reshaped both the landscape and the trajectory of human civilization. After the flood, something fundamental changed in the nature of kingship. The first post-flood ruler, Jusha of Kish, ruled for 1,200 years, still impossibly long by our standards, but a mere blink compared to the 30,000-year reigns of his predecessors. With each generation the reigns grew shorter, the kings more human, until finally we reach historical figures whose lifespans archaeology can actually verify. The transition from immortal to mortal, kingship wasn't immediate but gradual, as if the cosmic forces that had sustained the antediluvian rulers were slowly withdrawing from direct involvement in human affairs. Jusha's 1,200-year reign still placed him far beyond normal human experience, yet it represented less than 5% of Alulim's geological lifespan. Something had changed in the fundamental nature of royal authority. Some connection between heaven and earth had been altered by the great catastrophe. Following Yushur came Kulasina Bel, who ruled for 960 years, then Nangilissi with 830 years. Each successive reign showed the continuing erosion of superhuman longevity, as if kingship itself were gradually becoming more human, more subject to the natural limitations that governed ordinary mortal life. By the time we reach the later dynasties recorded in the King List, royal lifespans had contracted to merely extraordinary rather than impossible, 2 or 3 centuries instead of 20 or 30,000 years. This gradual shortening of royal lifespans suggests that the post-flood world wasn't simply a return to pre-flood conditions with shorter-lived kings. Instead, it represents a fundamental transformation in the relationship between divine and human authority. The antediluvian kings had ruled as direct representatives of cosmic forces, their impossible lifespans reflecting their role as bridges between mortal and immortal realms. The post-flood rulers, while still divinely appointed, governed within increasingly human parameters. Archaeological evidence from Kish, the first post-flood capital, reveals a city that was rebuilt with impressive speed and sophistication after the great catastrophe. The monumental architecture, the complex urban planning, the evidence of extensive trade networks, all suggest that the knowledge needed to organize complex civilization had survived the flood and been rapidly implemented by the new dynasty. Yet the material culture shows clear differences from pre-flood sites, as if the rebuilders were working from memory and tradition rather than direct continuity. The King List's record of gradually diminishing lifespans parallels what we know about human settlement patterns in post-flood Mesopotamia. Early sites show evidence of small, tightly organized communities that gradually expanded into larger urban centers over several centuries. The social organization appears more complex and hierarchical than what archaeologists find in pre-flood levels, suggesting that the survivors had learned from the catastrophe and developed more resilient forms of governance and administration. What's particularly striking about the post-flood section of the King List is its increasing precision and detail. Where the antediluvian records offer only names, cities, and impossibly long reign lengths, the post-flood entries begin to include additional information, genealogical connections, major achievements, sometimes even brief notes about historical events. It's as if the scribes who compiled the list had access to more detailed records for the post-flood period, or perhaps felt more confident about the accuracy of more recent traditions. The transition from superhuman to merely exceptional lifespans also coincides with the appearance of recognizable historical processes in the archaeological record. Where pre-flood sites show remarkable cultural continuity across vast time spans, post-flood archaeology reveals the normal patterns of dynastic change, territorial expansion, technological development, and cultural evolution that characterize historical civilizations. The post-flood kings, despite their still extraordinary lifespans, were governing societies that changed and developed in ways that modern historians can analyze and understand. Among the post-flood kings appears a name that echoes through world literature, Gilgamesh of Uruk, who ruled for 126 years. Here, the King List intersects with the world's oldest epic poem, transforming a literary hero into a historical figure whose reign is recorded with the same bureaucratic precision as tax records. Yet even Gilgamesh's 100-year rule suggests these early kings possessed lifespans far beyond ordinary human experience. The appearance of Gilgamesh in the King List creates a unique intersection between historical documentation and literary tradition. The epic that bears his name was already ancient when the earliest copies were inscribed on cuneiform tablets, yet here in the dry administrative record of royal succession, the legendary hero appears as simply another king in a long line of rulers, his reign noted with the same clerical precision applied to forgotten monarchs whose names appear nowhere else in ancient literature. But Gilgamesh's inclusion in the King List does more than verify his historical existence. It provides a chronological framework for understanding when the legendary events of its epic might have taken place. If we accept the King List's genealogical sequence, Gilgamesh ruled Uruk sometime during the early dynastic period, roughly contemporary with the historical kings of other Sumerian city-states whose reigns can be verified through independent archaeological evidence. Archaeological excavations at Uruk itself have revealed a city of remarkable size and sophistication during the period when Gilgamesh supposedly ruled. The massive temple complex dedicated to the sky god Anu and the goddess Inanna shows evidence of continuous rebuilding and expansion, suggesting a wealthy and powerful city-state capable of organizing vast construction projects. The famous Uruk walls, which figure prominently in the epic poem, have been traced by archaeologists as a defensive circuit encompassing an area larger than many modern cities. What makes Gilgamesh's entry in the King List particularly fascinating is how it transforms our understanding of the epic literature associated with his name. The poem presents Gilgamesh as a king obsessed with mortality, desperately seeking immortality after the death of his companion Enkidu. Yet the King List records his reign as lasting 126 years, far longer than any normal human lifespan, yet dramatically shorter than the reigns of earlier post-flood kings. This places Gilgamesh at a unique point in the transition from superhuman to human kingship, ruling during the period when royal lifespans were contracting toward mortal parameters. The epic's themes of mortality and the limits of human existence take on new meaning when viewed through the lens of the King List's chronological framework. Gilgamesh's quest for immortality wasn't simply the universal human struggle with mortality, it was the specific anguish of a king who lived during the age when royal immortality was being withdrawn, when the cosmic appointment that had sustained earlier rulers for tens of thousands of years was giving way to the more modest lifespans of ordinary human authority. Independent cuneiform sources from the early dynastic period mention kings of Uruk, whose names correspond to figures from the Gilgamesh epic, lending additional historical credibility to the King List's inclusion of the legendary hero. Royal inscriptions from Mesopotamian sites reference conflicts between Uruk and other city-states that parallel the political tensions described in the epic literature. The historical Gilgamesh appears to have been a real ruler who governed a real city during a period of significant political and cultural development. Yet the King List's matter-of-fact inclusion of Gilgamesh alongside obscure rulers whose names appear nowhere else in ancient literature suggests that the compilers of the document saw no fundamental difference between legendary and historical figures. To them, Gilgamesh was simply another king whose reign needed to be documented for the sake of administrative completeness, another link in the chain of royal succession that stretched back to the antediluvian age when kingship first descended from heaven. The precision with which Gilgamesh's reign length is recorded, 126 years, not approximately a century or roughly 120 years, suggests that the King List's compilers had access to detailed chronological records from Uruk itself. This level of specificity implies sophisticated record-keeping practices that preserved exact regnal years across centuries, a bureaucratic continuity that survived the political upheavals and dynastic changes that characterized early Mesopotamian history. To understand the King List, we must grasp how differently the ancient Sumerians conceived of time itself. Their word for eternity, Nam-til-la, literally meant the fullness of life. They believed that in the beginning, before the gods imposed limits on human existence, life stretched endlessly forward like an unbroken river. The impossible reign lengths weren't errors, they were memories of a time when death was not yet a boundary. The Sumerian understanding of time was fundamentally different from our modern, linear conception of past, present, and future, flowing in sequence from origin to destination. For the ancient Mesopotamians, time was more like a vast circular pattern, with events and epochs repeating in cosmic cycles that connected the deepest past to the farthest future. The antediluvian age wasn't simply long ago, it was the eternal template upon which all subsequent history was based, the original pattern that would eventually return when the great cycles completed their rotation. This cyclical view of time helps explain why the King List preserves such specific numbers for impossible lifespans. Each reign length wasn't arbitrary, but represented a precise position within cosmic cycles that governed not just individual lives but entire civilizations. The 43,200 years attributed to Enmenluanna weren't simply a very long time, they corresponded to specific astronomical calculations, perhaps tracking the precession of equinoxes or the orbital patterns of planets across multiple centuries. Sumerian mathematical texts reveal a sophisticated understanding of large numbers and complex calculations that modern mathematicians are still struggling to fully comprehend. Their numerical system was based on 60 rather than 10, allowing for precise fractional calculations and astronomical observations that required extraordinary mathematical sophistication. The same scribal tradition that could calculate planetary positions centuries in advance was certainly capable of maintaining precise chronological records across the vast timespans recorded in the King List. The concept of Nam-til-la, the fullness of life, suggests that the Sumerians understood the antediluvian age not as a historical period but as a state of being, a condition of existence where human consciousness wasn't bounded by the normal limitations of mortality. The first kings didn't simply live longer than modern humans. They lived differently, experiencing time and existence according to principles that connected them more directly to cosmic rhythms and celestial cycles. Religious texts from ancient Mesopotamia describe death not as natural conclusion but as divine punishment imposed upon humanity after some primordial transgression. Before this punishment was enacted, human life partook of divine nature, stretching indefinitely into the future, without the boundary that mortality imposes upon consciousness and experience. The impossible lifespans of antediluvian kings weren't miraculous exceptions. They were examples of what human existence had been like before the gods decided that mortality was necessary to prevent some cosmic imbalance. This theological understanding of mortality as imposed limitation rather than natural boundary helps explain why the King List records the gradual shortening of royal lifespans after the flood. The catastrophe that swept away the antediluvian world wasn't just environmental but spiritual, marking the final implementation of divine limits upon human existence. The post-flood kings ruled within increasingly mortal parameters, not because they were less worthy than their predecessors, but because the cosmic conditions that had sustained immortal consciousness were no longer available in the transformed world. These scribes who compiled and preserved the King List across centuries weren't simply recording historical curiosities. They were maintaining connection to a form of consciousness and existence that their own age could barely comprehend. Each copying of the impossible numbers was an act of preservation, keeping alive the memory of what human life had been like when it partook more directly of divine nature and cosmic time. As we drift deeper into the mysteries, beyond applications and theory, quantum mechanics is changing how we think about nature. It's teaching us that reality is non-local, contextual, and informational. It's showing us that observation is participation, that separability is an illusion, and that the classical world of definite objects is an approximation. These lessons extend beyond physics. They influence philosophy, reshaping debates about determinism, realism, and knowledge. They touch on consciousness, raising questions about the role of observers and the nature of mind. They even inspire art and literature, as the strangeness of the quantum world captures human imagination. As quantum technologies become more common, society will face new challenges. Quantum computers might break current encryption, requiring new cryptographic methods. Quantum sensing might enable surveillance in new ways, raising privacy concerns. The quantum internet might create new forms of inequality between those with access and those without. These are not just technical issues, but ethical and political ones. As quantum mechanics moves from laboratories into daily life, we'll need to think carefully about how to use these powerful tools responsibly, ensuring that quantum technologies benefit humanity broadly and don't concentrate power in a few hands. Looking further ahead, quantum mechanics may reveal even deeper layers of reality. Perhaps the quantum realm itself is emergent, arising from more fundamental structures. Perhaps the universe is at its core a quantum computer, processing information according to rules we're only beginning to grasp. Whatever the future holds, quantum mechanics has already transformed our world and our understanding. From atoms to algorithms, from philosophy to technology, the quantum realm shapes everything. Its strangeness is not a flaw, but a feature, pointing us toward truths that transcend our everyday intuitions. The journey into the quantum realm is far from over. Each discovery opens new questions. Each application enables new explorations. The quantum future is bright, filled with possibilities as strange and wonderful as the quantum world itself. We live in a quantum universe. Every breath you take, every thought you think, every color you see, emerges from quantum processes. The electrons in your neurons, the photons entering your eyes, the atoms bonding in your cells, all obey quantum rules. Yet we don't perceive the quantum world directly. Our senses evolved to navigate the macroscopic realm, where quantum effects are hidden by decoherence and averaging. A thrown ball follows a definite path. A chair has a definite position. The everyday world seems classical, solid, and predictable. This classical appearance is an illusion, or rather an approximation. Underneath, the quantum realm churns. Electrons occupy orbitals, probability clouds rather than fixed orbits. Atoms tunnel through barriers, appearing on the other side without crossing the point in the chronological sequence. Where the Sumerian King List presents the deluge as separating an age of immortal kings from an age of increasingly mortal rulers, Genesis describes the flood as divine judgment upon universal human wickedness, with Noah and his family preserved as the righteous remnant from which humanity would be renewed. The theological frameworks differ, but both traditions agree that the flood marked the end of one form of human existence and the beginning of another. The parallel existence of these traditions across different cultures suggests that the memory of antediluvian longevity wasn't unique to Mesopotamia, but reflected a widespread understanding of human history shared across the ancient Near East. The Hebrew patriarchs weren't borrowing from Sumerian mythology. They were preserving their own version of the same fundamental memory, transmitted through different cultural channels, but originating from the same historical substrate. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal connections between early Mesopotamian and biblical traditions that go beyond literary borrowing to suggest shared historical experiences. The Royal Archives at Ebla, discovered in 1975, contain thousands of cuneiform tablets that mention place names and personal names familiar from biblical accounts, indicating cultural continuity across the ancient Near East that could have preserved common memories of the antediluvian age. What's particularly striking about the biblical preservation of extended lifespans is how the numbers gradually decrease across the generations, paralleling the pattern observed in the post-flood section of the Sumerian King List. After Noah, lifespans continue to shorten. Abraham lived 175 years, Isaac 180 years, Jacob 147 years. By the time we reach historical figures like King David, lifespans have contracted to recognizably human proportions, suggesting that both traditions preserve memory of the same gradual transition from superhuman to normal human mortality. The Sumerian King List exists in multiple versions, each discovered at different archaeological sites, each preserving slight variations in names, numbers, and sequences. The most complete version, known as the Weld-Blundell Prism, was discovered at Lhasa and dates to the reign of Sin-Magir around 2100 BCE. Yet even this complete version is a copy of copies, preserving traditions that were already ancient when the scribes carved them into clay. The existence of multiple versions of the King List creates both opportunities and challenges for modern scholars attempting to reconstruct the original tradition. Each copy reflects the priorities and understanding of its particular time and place, introducing subtle variations that accumulated across centuries of transmission. The Weld-Blundell Prism, housed today in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, represents the most systematic attempt by ancient scribes to compile a comprehensive record, but even this authoritative version shows evidence of editorial decisions that shaped how the tradition was preserved. Comparing the different versions reveals fascinating patterns in how ancient scribes approached the preservation of impossibly ancient records. Some versions include additional kings omitted by others. Some provide alternate spellings of royal names or assign different reign lengths to the same rulers. These variations weren't errors or corruptions, but reflect different scribal traditions, each maintaining its own understanding of how the antediluvian age should be remembered and documented. The Tumul inscription discovered at Nippur preserves a different sequence of early rulers that overlaps with, but doesn't exactly match the standard king list. The Sumerian King List from Ur offers variations in several royal names and includes additional genealogical information not found in other versions. Each discovery adds pieces to the puzzle, while simultaneously complicating our understanding of how these ancient traditions were maintained and transmitted. What emerges from comparing multiple versions is evidence of remarkable consistency in the essential structure and chronology, despite variations in specific details. All versions agree on the basic framework: impossibly long-lived antediluvian kings, a great flood that reset the world, followed by gradually shortening post-flood reigns that eventually reach historically verifiable proportions. This consistency across different scribal traditions suggests that the core narrative was so fundamental to Mesopotamian understanding of history that it could not be substantially altered, only refined and updated. The process by which these ancient records were copied and preserved reveals the extraordinary care with which Mesopotamian scribes approached their responsibility as guardians of historical memory. Each copying was an act of sacred transmission, preserving for future generations knowledge that was already ancient beyond comprehension. The scribes who created the weld Blundell prism were working from sources that were older than their own civilization, maintaining traditions that stretched back through the mists of time to the very beginning of human record-keeping. Archaeological evidence suggests that the scribal schools of ancient Mesopotamia maintained libraries of historical texts that served as reference sources for compiling comprehensive records like the King List. The discovery of tablet catalogues at sites like Nineveh and Babylon reveals systematic efforts to collect, organize, and preserve ancient documents, ensuring that important traditions would survive the political upheavals and dynastic changes that characterized Mesopotamian history. The variations between different versions of the King List also provide insight into how ancient scholars understood the relationship between historical accuracy and cultural relevance. Some scribes emphasized chronological precision, carefully preserving exact numbers and sequences. Others focused on genealogical connections, showing how different royal dynasties related to each other across time. Still others highlighted religious and theological themes, presenting the King List as a record of divine providence operating through human history. Modern scholars debate whether any version of the King List preserves the original tradition, or whether all surviving copies represent evolved forms of earlier sources that are now lost. The textual evidence suggests that the tradition was fluid rather than fixed, maintained through living scholarly communities that continue to refine and update their understanding of the antediluvian age based on new discoveries and changing historical perspectives. In the 3rd century BCE, a Babylonian priest named Berossus translated ancient Mesopotamian records into Greek, preserving in his Babyloniaca a list of 10 kings who ruled before the flood for a total of 432,000 years. His work, now lost except for fragments preserved by later historians, suggests that the tradition of antediluvian super kings was still alive and carefully maintained more than 2 millennia after the Sumerian King List was first compiled. Berossus represents a crucial link between the ancient Mesopotamian tradition and the Hellenistic world, translating not just language but entire worldviews for Greek-speaking audiences who had no direct access to cuneiform literature. His Babyloniaca, written during the reign of Antiochus III, was intended to introduce Greek intellectuals to the deep antiquity and sophisticated knowledge of Babylonian civilization, countering Greek assumptions about barbarian primitiveness with evidence of mathematical, astronomical, and historical achievements that preceded Greek culture by thousands of years. The fragments of Berossus preserved by later historians like Josephus, Eusebius, and Syncellus provide tantalizing glimpses of how he adapted Sumerian King List traditions for Greek audiences. His 10 antediluvian kings don't match exactly with the 8 rulers listed in the cuneiform sources, suggesting that he was working from different textual traditions, or that he made editorial decisions to create a more systematic presentation. The total of 432,000 years for all 10 reigns represents an enormous span of time, yet it's calculated with the same precision that characterizes Mesopotamian mathematical astronomy. What makes Berossus particularly valuable as a historical source is his dual identity as both Babylonian priest and Hellenistic scholar. He possessed direct access to temple libraries and ancient records that were maintained by the same priestly families who had preserved them for millennia, yet he also understood Greek intellectual categories and could present Mesopotamian traditions in forms that would be comprehensible to Mediterranean audiences. His translation wasn't simply linguistic but cultural, bridging two very different ways of understanding history, time, and human origins. The survival of Berossus's King List through later Greek and Roman historians demonstrates the continued fascination that ancient Mediterranean intellectuals felt for traditions of extreme antiquity and superhuman longevity. Even as Greek philosophy developed increasingly sophisticated understanding of natural law and physical causation, the memory of antediluvian immortality retained its power to challenge assumptions about the boundaries of human existence and the nature of historical time. Later, historians who preserved fragments of Berossus often expressed skepticism about the enormous chronologies he reported, yet they continued to transmit his accounts because they recognized their importance as records of ancient learning. Josephus cited Berossus as evidence for the historical accuracy of biblical chronology. Eusebius included him in his comprehensive survey of ancient historical traditions. Even critics who doubted the literal accuracy of the extended lifespans acknowledged that these traditions preserved important information about the deep antiquity of Mesopotamian civilization. The loss of Berossus's complete work represents one of the great tragedies of ancient scholarship, depriving us of what was probably the most comprehensive ancient attempt to synthesize Mesopotamian historical traditions for non-Mesopotamian audiences. The surviving fragments suggest that his Babylonica included not just royal chronologies but detailed accounts of early civilization, religious traditions, astronomical observations, and technological developments that would have provided invaluable insight into how ancient scholars understood their own past. Modern attempts to reconstruct Berossus's chronology face the same challenges that confronted ancient historians: how to reconcile impossibly long lifespans with rational understanding of human mortality, how to integrate Mesopotamian traditions with other ancient historical accounts, how to distinguish between literal historical claims and symbolic or astronomical encodings that might be embedded within chronological data. The persistence of the antediluvian king tradition through Berossus into the Hellenistic period demonstrates that these records weren't simply cultural artifacts preserved by scholarly antiquarianism, but living traditions that continued to shape how ancient intellectuals understood human history and the relationship between divine and mortal realms. Egypt possessed its own traditions of impossibly long reigns. The Sumerian King List speaks of Neteru, divine beings who ruled Egypt for thousands of years before the first human pharaoh took the throne. Manetho's Egyptiaca describes a time when gods ruled Egypt for 13,900 years, followed by demigods who governed for another 11,000 years. Across cultures, the memory persists of an age when rulers were more than human. The Egyptian preservation of superhuman royal chronologies suggests that the phenomenon recorded in the Sumerian King List wasn't unique to Mesopotamia, but reflected a widespread ancient understanding of early human history. The Neteru of Egyptian tradition weren't mythological figures, but were presented as historical rulers whose reigns could be dated and documented with the same precision applied to later pharaonic dynasties. This wasn't folklore but formal historiography, maintained by the same priestly institutions that preserved astronomical observations and mathematical calculations across millennia. Manetho, writing in the 3rd century BCE under Ptolemaic patronage, had access to temple archives that preserved records stretching back to the very beginning of Egyptian civilization. His division of pre-pharaonic history into distinct periods, gods ruling for 13,900 years, followed by spirits of the dead ruling for 13,670 years, followed by demigods ruling for 11,000 years, creates a chronological framework that parallels the Sumerian distinction between antediluvian and post-flood eras. The Sumerian King List, inscribed on papyrus during the reign of Ramesses II, preserves what appears to be an official royal chronology that begins with divine rulers before transitioning to recognizably human pharaohs. The document treats the Neteru not as mythological precursors, but as legitimate predecessors whose reigns established the precedents and traditions that governed later Egyptian kingship. The transition from divine to human rule wasn't presented as mythological development, but as historical process that could be documented and dated. What emerges from comparing Egyptian and Mesopotamian traditions is evidence of parallel but independent preservation of memories concerning an age when rulership operated according to different principles than those familiar to historical periods. The specific chronologies differ. Egyptian divine reigns are measured in thousands rather than tens of thousands of years, but both cultures maintained that early rulers possessed lifespans and abilities that transcended normal human limitations. Archaeological evidence from pre-dynastic Egypt reveals the rapid development of sophisticated political and religious institutions that appear almost fully formed in the earliest historical records. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under the first pharaohs involved organizational capabilities and engineering achievements that suggest the availability of accumulated knowledge and experience far beyond what would be expected from recently developed societies. The sudden appearance of hieroglyphic writing, monumental architecture, and complex governmental bureaucracies parallels the mysterious sophistication of early Sumerian civilization. The religious traditions preserved in Egyptian temple complexes maintain that the Neteru weren't simply early rulers, but cosmic forces that had taken human form to establish civilization and teach humanity the arts of government, agriculture, medicine, and astronomy. These divine kings weren't temporary occupants of the throne, but eternal principles made manifest in historical time, connecting earthly rule to celestial order in ways that later human pharaohs could only approximate through ritual and symbolism. The consistency with which Egyptian sources present impossibly long divine reigns suggests that these weren't late mythological additions to historical tradition, but represented ancient memories that had been carefully preserved through institutional continuity. The same priestly families that maintained astronomical observations and calendar systems across centuries also preserved chronological records that reached back to the first establishment of ordered government in the Nile Valley. Parallel traditions of superhuman early rulers have been identified in other ancient civilizations as well. Hindu Puranic literature describes the reigns of divine kings lasting thousands of years. Chinese historical texts speak of legendary emperors whose rule stretched across vast time spans. Mesoamerican civilizations preserve traditions of god kings whose lifespans transcended normal human experience. The global distribution of such traditions suggests they preserve common memories of conditions that once prevailed across human societies, rather than representing independent mythological developments. Recent archaeological discoveries challenge our understanding of early Mesopotamian chronology. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, with its massive stone circles dating to 10,000 BCE, suggests that complex societies existed far earlier than previously believed. The sophistication of early Sumerian cities like Eridu appears almost overnight in the archaeological record, as if civilization didn't gradually develop but suddenly manifested, already mature and complex. The discoveries at Göbekli Tepe have forced archaeologists to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the development of human civilization. The site's massive stone pillars, some weighing as much as 50 tons, were quarried, transported and erected by people who were supposedly still living as hunter-gatherers without permanent settlements or complex social organization. Yet the sophistication of the carving, the astronomical alignments of the structures, and the organizational capabilities required for such construction suggest levels of knowledge and social coordination that challenge conventional chronologies of human development. What makes Göbekli Tepe particularly relevant to understanding the Sumerian King List is its extreme antiquity combined with its obvious sophistication. If complex monumental architecture and organized labor were possible in 10,000 BCE, then the technological and social foundations needed to support the early Sumerian cities were available much earlier than previously assumed. The gap between hunter-gatherer societies and urban civilizations may be less dramatic than archaeologists have traditionally believed. Similar anomalies appear throughout the archaeological record of early Mesopotamia. The city of Eridu shows evidence of sophisticated urban planning from its earliest levels, as if the first settlers arrived with fully developed concepts of how cities should be organized. The earliest pottery from Mesopotamian sites displays technical excellence and artistic sophistication that suggests long traditions of ceramic production, yet these traditions appear in the archaeological record without clear developmental sequences that would indicate gradual improvement over time. The astronomical knowledge embedded in early Mesopotamian texts poses similar chronological puzzles. Babylonian mathematical astronomy was capable of predicting eclipses and planetary positions with precision that wouldn't be matched again until the development of modern telescopic observation. Such mathematical sophistication requires not just individual genius, but institutional continuity across many generations of careful observation and calculation. Yet the earliest astronomical texts appear in the record as if such knowledge had always been available rather than having developed through gradual accumulation of observations. The engineering achievements visible in early Mesopotamian cities also suggest access to knowledge and techniques that had been refined over much longer periods than conventional chronology allows. The irrigation systems that supported urban populations required sophisticated understanding of hydraulics, soil management, and agricultural planning. The monumental architecture found at sites like Uruk involved construction techniques and organizational capabilities that appear fully developed without clear antecedents in simpler building traditions. Recent underwater archaeology in the Persian Gulf has identified submerged settlements that date to periods when sea levels were much lower than today. These discoveries suggest that early human societies developed in coastal areas that are now underwater, potentially hiding archaeological evidence for much earlier complex societies than those visible in the terrestrial record. If the Sumerian cities represented the inland continuation of civilizations that had originally developed along now submerged coastlines, their apparent sudden sophistication might reflect migration and cultural transmission rather than spontaneous development. The linguistic evidence from early Mesopotamia also supports the possibility of much greater antiquity for complex societies than conventional archaeology suggests. Sumerian appears in the earliest written records as a fully developed language with complex grammar, extensive vocabulary, and sophisticated literary traditions. Languages don't spring into existence fully formed. They develop over many centuries of use by large populations engaged in complex cultural activities. The sophistication of early Sumerian literature suggests much longer periods of cultural development than the conventional chronology of Mesopotamian urbanization allows. Genetic studies of modern Middle Eastern populations have identified population movements and cultural contacts that occurred much earlier than previously suspected, suggesting that the ancient Near East was connected by trade networks and cultural exchanges that facilitated the spread of knowledge and techniques across vast distances and time periods. The early Sumerian cities may represent the culmination of cultural developments that had been proceeding for millennia across a much wider geographic area than traditional archaeology has recognized. As we contemplate these archaeological anomalies and chronological mysteries, the impossible lifespans recorded in the Sumerian King List begin to seem less like mythological exaggeration and more like institutional memory of conditions that once actually existed. Perhaps the ancient scribes were preserving not fantasy, but history. History from an age so remote that its very possibility challenges our assumptions about the development and antiquity of human civilization. Something puzzling emerges from the archaeological record of ancient Sumer. Around 3500 BCE, complex urban civilization appears to manifest with startling completeness. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, complex government, all seeming to arrive simultaneously rather than developing gradually over centuries. It's as if the knowledge needed to build cities and rule kingdoms was already present, waiting to be implemented by people who remembered how things had been done before. This sudden flowering of civilization in southern Mesopotamia defies the conventional understanding of cultural evolution, which assumes that complex societies develop gradually through incremental improvements over many generations. Yet the earlier Sumerian cities display sophistication that suggests not innovation, but implementation. Not the tentative experiments of first-time urban planners, but the confident execution of blueprints that had been perfected long before the first foundations were laid in the Mesopotamian mud. The city of Uruk, which reached unprecedented size and complexity by 3200 BCE, shows no clear developmental sequence leading to its urban sophistication. The earliest levels reveal planned neighborhoods, sophisticated drainage systems, monumental architecture, and administrative complexes that functioned as efficiently as anything built centuries later. The famous White Temple complex at Uruk displays engineering and architectural knowledge that appears fully mature in its earliest manifestations, as if its builders were following construction principles that had been tested and refined across many previous projects. The invention of writing itself presents similar chronological puzzles. The earliest cuneiform tablets from Uruk aren't primitive scratches in clay, but sophisticated administrative documents that presuppose complex economic systems, mathematical calculations, and bureaucratic procedures. The script appears in the archaeological record already capable of recording not just simple inventories, but complex legal contracts, religious literature, and mathematical texts. Languages and writing systems don't develop overnight. They require centuries of use by literate communities engaged in activities complex enough to necessitate written record keeping. Mesopotamian metallurgy shows the same pattern of sudden sophistication. The earliest bronze artifacts display technical mastery that suggests long traditions of experimentation and refinement, yet these traditions appear in the archaeological record without clear antecedents in simpler metalworking techniques. The knowledge required to locate ore deposits, construct furnaces capable of reaching appropriate temperatures, and develop alloy recipes for different applications implies generations of accumulated experience that somehow preceded the first urban settlements where such knowledge could have been systematically developed and transmitted. The astronomical knowledge embedded in early Mesopotamian texts poses perhaps the most challenging chronological puzzle. Babylonian mathematical astronomy was capable of calculations that required not just individual brilliance, but institutional continuity across many centuries of careful observation. The prediction of eclipses, the tracking of planetary cycles, the development of sophisticated calendar systems. All of these achievements presuppose observational records maintained across time spans that dwarf the conventional chronology of Mesopotamian urban development. Archaeological surveys of the broader Mesopotamian region have failed to identify the gradual developmental sequence that conventional theory would predict. There are no intermediate stages showing the slow accumulation of urban planning knowledge, no experimental phases in monumental construction, no clear progression from simple to complex administrative systems. Instead, the archaeological record presents a sharp discontinuity. Simple farming villages followed almost immediately by sophisticated urban centres that functioned with remarkable efficiency from their earliest documented phases. The irrigation systems that supported Mesopotamian urban populations represent another manifestation of this mysterious suddenness. These weren't simple channels dug to divert river water, but sophisticated hydraulic networks that required precise engineering to maintain appropriate gradients across vast distances, prevent silting, and distribute water equitably among competing users. The organizational knowledge needed to plan, construct, and maintain such systems implies administrative experience and technical expertise that somehow preceded the urban civilizations they were designed to support. Recent discoveries in underwater archaeology have begun to suggest possible explanations for this apparent suddenness. Submerged sites in the Persian Gulf and elsewhere reveal that complex societies may have developed in coastal areas that are now underwater due to post-glacial sea level rise. If the Mesopotamian cities represented the inland continuation of civilizations that had originally developed along now submerged coastlines, their apparent sudden sophistication might reflect cultural transmission and migration rather than spontaneous local development. The King List's preservation of impossibly ancient royal traditions takes on new significance when viewed against this archaeological backdrop. If the earliest Mesopotamian cities were indeed rebuilt or relocated versions of even more ancient settlements, then the scribes who compile the King List may have been preserving genuine historical memories of rulers whose reigns began in those lost coastal civilizations. The impossible lifespans might not be mythological exaggeration, but compressed memories of institutional continuity that stretched back through multiple phases of civilizational development and relocation. The same scribal tradition that preserved the King List also maintained astronomical records of stunning precision. Babylonian astronomers could predict eclipses centuries in advance and tracked planetary cycles across vast periods. Their mathematical astronomy was so accurate that modern computers verify their calculations. Perhaps cultures capable of such temporal precision approached the measurement of kingly reigns with similar astronomical sophistication. The astronomical achievements of ancient Mesopotamian civilization represent one of humanity's most remarkable intellectual accomplishments. Yet they appear in the historical record with the same mysterious suddenness that characterizes other aspects of Sumerian culture. The earliest astronomical texts presuppose observational records and mathematical techniques that would have required centuries to develop, yet they emerge from the archaeological darkness already fully formed and capable of calculations that wouldn't be surpassed until the development of modern mathematical astronomy. Babylonian astronomers maintained ephemeris tables that could predict the positions of planets centuries into the future with accuracy that modern computer calculations confirm to within minutes of arc. They developed sophisticated mathematical models that accounted for the variable speeds of planetary motion, the complex cycles of lunar phases and eclipses, and the precession of equinoxes across vast time periods. Such precision required not just mathematical brilliance, but institutional continuity that preserved and refined observational records across many generations. The famous Venus tablet of Amisaduca records observations of the planet Venus that extend back for decades, tracking its appearances and disappearances with systematic precision that reveals deep understanding of planetary cycles. Similar records exist for all the visible planets, creating an astronomical database that encompasses observations spanning centuries. The compilation and maintenance of such records required dedicated observers working within institutions that could preserve their data across the political upheavals and dynastic changes that characterize Mesopotamian history. What makes these astronomical achievements particularly relevant to understanding the King List is the evidence they provide for Mesopotamian capabilities in measuring and recording vast time spans with mathematical precision. If Babylonian astronomers could track planetary cycles across centuries and predict eclipses decades in advance, they certainly possessed the numerical concepts and record-keeping techniques needed to maintain accurate chronological records across the geological timespans attributed to antediluvian kings. The mathematical basis of Mesopotamian astronomy reveals sophisticated understanding of cycles within cycles, with shorter periodicities embedded within longer ones in complex patterns that required computational techniques not rediscovered until the Renaissance. The Babylonian understanding of the Saros cycle, a period of approximately 18 years and 11 days after which eclipses repeat in similar patterns, demonstrates their ability to recognize and calculate temporal relationships that operated across multiple decades. Even more remarkably, Mesopotamian astronomers understood and calculated the precession of equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the apparent position of stars to shift gradually over periods of approximately 26,000 years. This discovery required observational records maintained across many centuries and mathematical techniques capable of detecting changes so gradual that they would be invisible within individual lifetimes. The ability to recognize and calculate precessional motion suggests observational continuity that stretched back across time spans comparable to the reign lengths recorded in the King List. The integration of astronomical knowledge with royal chronology appears throughout Mesopotamian texts, suggesting that the same intellectual traditions responsible for tracking planetary cycles also maintained records of royal succession. The correlation of significant historical events with astronomical phenomena, eclipses, planetary conjunctions, the appearances of comets, indicates that Mesopotamian scribes understood chronological record-keeping as fundamentally connected to celestial observation. The precision with which impossible reign lengths are recorded in the King List parallels the mathematical exactitude of Mesopotamian astronomical texts. Just as Babylonian ephemeris tables specify planetary positions to fractions of degrees, the King List records royal lifespans to specific years rather than round numbers or approximate ranges. This suggests that both traditions emerge from the same scribal culture that valued numerical precision as essential to the preservation of accurate knowledge across vast time periods. Modern scholars studying Mesopotamian astronomy continue to discover new layers of sophistication in calculations that were already ancient when Alexander the Great conquered Babylon. The same intellectual tradition that could predict the return of Halley's comet and calculate the length of the year to within minutes also preserved the chronological framework that connected the post-flood world to the impossible antiquity of the antediluvian kings. How did post-flood civilizations recover complex knowledge so quickly? The King List suggests an answer. Some knowledge survived because some people survived, carrying with them not just the memory of great kings, but the wisdom those kings had accumulated across their impossible lifespans. The first post-flood cities weren't starting from scratch. They were rebuilding what had been lost, guided by survivors who remembered how things had been done in the world before the waters came. The rapid reconstruction of sophisticated urban civilization after the Great Flood presents one of the most puzzling aspects of early Mesopotamian history. If the catastrophe had been as complete as the King List suggests, wiping away not just populations but entire ways of life that had developed across tens of thousands of years, how could the survivors have possessed the knowledge necessary to rebuild complex societies within a few generations? The answer may lie in understanding the flood not as total destruction, but as selective preservation, a catastrophe that destroyed physical infrastructure while allowing crucial knowledge to survive through human memory and portable records. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves the story of Utnapishtim, who survived the Great Flood by building a vessel large enough to carry not just his family and animals, but also craftsmen and artisans whose skills would be essential for rebuilding civilization after the waters receded. This detail, often overlooked in favour of the more dramatic elements of the flood narrative, suggests that the survivors weren't simply lucky individuals who happened to escape drowning, but were deliberately chosen to preserve the knowledge and capabilities needed to restore human society. Archaeological evidence from post-flood Mesopotamian sites reveals patterns that support this interpretation. The earliest levels at Kish, the first post-flood capital according to the King List, show evidence of planned urban development that could only have been implemented by people who understood the principles of city planning, hydraulic engineering, and administrative organization. The construction techniques, architectural styles, and urban layouts don't represent experimental attempts by people learning these skills for the first time. They reflect confident application of knowledge that had been preserved through the catastrophe. The cuneiform texts themselves provide evidence for continuity of knowledge across the flood boundary. Many of the earliest post-flood documents reference older texts and traditions, suggesting that at least some written records had survived the catastrophe or been faithfully reproduced from memory immediately afterward. The precision with which pre-flood traditions are preserved in later texts indicates systematic efforts to maintain cultural continuity despite the physical destruction of the antediluvian world. The King List's record of gradually shortening lifespans after the flood suggests that the survivors weren't ordinary humans, but individuals who retained some aspects of the superhuman nature that had characterized antediluvian rulers. Jusha's 1200-year reign, while dramatically shorter than pre-flood standards, still placed him far beyond normal human mortality. Perhaps the flood had altered the cosmic conditions that sustained immortal consciousness, but the survivors retained enough of their original nature to bridge the gap between the old world and the new. Religious texts from across Mesopotamian civilization preserve traditions of culture, heroes and divine teachers who appeared after the flood to instruct humanity in the arts of civilization. These figures, often described as fish-like beings or amphibious creatures who emerge from the waters, taught agriculture, metallurgy, writing, astronomy and law to populations that had supposedly lost such knowledge in the catastrophe. The consistent appearance of such traditions suggests cultural memory of actual historical figures who possessed advanced knowledge and were responsible for transmitting it to post-flood societies. The speed with which complex knowledge reappeared after the flood also suggests that much of the essential information had been encoded in forms that could survive catastrophic disruption. Astronomical cycles, mathematical relationships, architectural proportions, and agricultural techniques don't require a physical infrastructure to preserve. They can be maintained in human memory and transmitted through oral tradition until conditions allow their practical implementation. The antediluvian kings, with their geological lifespans, would have possessed memory capacities that could serve as living libraries, preserving vast amounts of cultural knowledge across the catastrophic transition. Modern studies of traditional societies have documented remarkable feats of cultural transmission through oral tradition, with complex bodies of knowledge preserved accurately across many generations through carefully structured memorization techniques. If the antediluvian rulers possessed the extended lifespans recorded in the King List, they would have been capable of maintaining such knowledge systems across time periods that encompassed entire cycles of civilizational development and decline. The institutional memory preserved in Mesopotamian temples provides additional evidence for knowledge continuity across the flood boundary. Temple complexes served not just as religious centers, but as repositories for technical knowledge, astronomical observations, mathematical calculations and historical records. The same priestly families that maintain these institutions across centuries also preserve the traditions that connected post-flood civilization to its antediluvian origins. Recent geological and archaeological evidence continues to support the reality of catastrophic flooding in ancient Mesopotamia. Analysis of sediment cores from the Persian Gulf reveals evidence of massive flood events around 7,000 years ago. Satellite imagery has identified ancient riverbeds and flood channels that match descriptions in Mesopotamian texts. The flood may have been more than myth. It may have been the defining trauma that separated one age of human history from another. The accumulation of geological evidence for catastrophic flooding in the ancient Near East has transformed scholarly understanding of the relationship between Mesopotamian flood narratives and historical reality. What was once dismissed as purely mythological now appears to preserve accurate cultural memory of environmental catastrophes that fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization. Core samples extracted from the floor of the Persian Gulf reveal sediment layers that document massive freshwater influxes during the period when the King List places the Great Flood. Satellite imagery and underwater archaeology have revealed extensive submerged landscapes in the Persian Gulf that were dry land during periods of lower sea level. These submerged areas contain clear evidence of ancient river channels, suggesting that the Tigris and Euphrates once flowed through a much larger valley before reaching the sea. As sea levels rose during the final phases of the last ice age, this entire region would have been gradually inundated, forcing populations to migrate inland to areas that would become the historical heartland of Mesopotamian civilization. The scale of this environmental change was enormous. Thousands of square kilometers of inhabited land disappeared beneath rising waters over a period of several centuries, creating a migration pressure that would have concentrated populations in the remaining habitable areas along the major rivers. The stress of such massive population displacement, combined with the loss of established agricultural areas and settled communities, would have created exactly the kind of civilizational crisis that the King List describes in its account of the Great Flood. Recent discoveries of submerged archaeological sites in the Persian Gulf have begun to reveal the sophistication of the civilizations that were lost beneath the rising waters. Underwater surveys have identified what appear to be planned settlements, monumental structures, and harbour facilities that suggest complex societies capable of organising large-scale construction projects and maintaining extensive trade networks. If these submerged sites represent the coastal civilizations that preceded the inland Mesopotamian cities, they would explain the mysterious suddenness with which sophisticated urban culture appeared in the archaeological record. Climate data extracted from ice cores and marine sediments reveals that the period around 7,000 years ago was marked by rapid and dramatic environmental changes that would have created catastrophic flooding conditions across the entire region. The final collapse of ice sheets in North America and Europe released enormous volumes of fresh water into the world's oceans, raising sea levels and altering precipitation patterns in ways that would have brought unprecedented flooding to river valleys like those of Mesopotamia. Archaeological evidence from terrestrial sites confirms the reality of catastrophic flooding during this period. The famous flood layers discovered by Leonard Woolley at and confirmed at multiple other sites across Mesopotamia all date to roughly the same time period indicated by the geological evidence. The consistency of this dating across multiple lines of evidence archaeological, geological, and climatological, strongly supports the historical reality of the flood event recorded in the King List. The discovery of ancient DNA in sediment cores has begun to reveal the biological impact of these environmental catastrophes. Genetic material preserved in flood deposits shows evidence of massive population disruption and replacement, consistent with the King List's account of civilizational discontinuity followed by rebuilding under new leadership. The genetic evidence suggests that post-flood populations included both survivors from local groups and immigrants from other regions, supporting the narrative of selective survival and cultural reconstruction. Modern hydrological modelling has confirmed that the type of flooding described in Mesopotamian texts was not only possible, but probable, given the environmental conditions that prevailed during the transition from the last ice age to the current interglacial period. Computer simulations of ancient river systems and sea level changes show that massive inundations would have been regular occurrences during periods of rapid climate change, creating exactly the conditions that would have separated the antediluvian world from the post-flood era recorded in the King List. Some scholars suggest the impossible rain lengths in the King List weren't meant to be taken literally, but served as a sophisticated calendar system. The numbers might encode astronomical cycles, tracking the precession of equinoxes or other celestial phenomena across vast periods. In this reading, the antediluvian kings become temporal markers, their reigns representing not individual lifespans but cosmic ages preserved in the memory of priest astronomers. This interpretation transforms the King List from a record of individual rulers into a sophisticated chronological framework that encoded vast spans of time within memorable narrative structures. Just as Mesopotamian astronomers embedded complex mathematical relationships within mythological stories about gods and heroes, the compilers of the King List may have used royal genealogies to preserve knowledge about cosmic cycles that operated across timescales far beyond individual human experience. The specific numbers recorded for antediluvian rain lengths show mathematical relationships that suggest astronomical rather than biographical significance. Alulim's 28,800 years corresponds closely to important cycles in the precession of equinoxes. Alaljar's 36,000 years relates to the orbital periods of outer planets. Enmenluanna's 43,200 years approximates twice the precessional cycle, suggesting that these numbers were calculated rather than remembered lifespans. Mesopotamian astronomical texts reveal sophisticated understanding of nested cycles within cycles, with shorter periodicities embedded within longer ones in complex patterns that required computational techniques of remarkable sophistication. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa tracks 8-year cycles of Venus observations within longer cycles that encompass multiple decades. Similar nesting patterns appear in lunar calendars, eclipse predictions, and planetary ephemerides, suggesting that Mesopotamian astronomers routinely worked with temporal frameworks that operated across multiple scales simultaneously. The use of royal genealogies to encode astronomical knowledge appears in other ancient cultures as well. Egyptian king lists include rulers whose reign lengths correspond to important stellar cycles. Hindu Puranic literature presents royal dynasties whose lifespans track cosmic ages measured in thousands or millions of years. Chinese historical texts preserve emperors whose reigns correspond to significant calendrical periods. This global distribution of astronomical encoding within royal chronologies suggests a widespread ancient practice of preserving temporal knowledge through narrative structures. The King List division of history into antediluvian and post-flood periods may reflect astronomical understanding of great world ages that were defined by celestial cycles rather than terrestrial events. Many ancient cultures recognized cosmic periods determined by the precession of equinoxes or other long-term astronomical phenomena, dividing time into ages that lasted thousands or tens of thousands of years. The flood may not have been understood as a singular historical event, but as a regular transition point between cosmic ages that occurred according to predictable celestial schedules. This astronomical interpretation helps explain why the King List's impossible chronologies were preserved with such care across centuries of copying and transmission. If the document served as a computational aid for astronomical calculations, its numerical precision would have been essential for maintaining accurate calendar systems and eclipse predictions. The scribes who copied these records weren't preserving historical curiosities, but maintaining working tools that were actively used by astronomer priests in their observations and calculations. The integration of astronomical and royal chronologies also explains the gradual transition from impossible to merely extraordinary lifespans in the post-flood section of the King List. As astronomical knowledge became more sophisticated and record-keeping more systematic, the need to encode temporal information within royal genealogies may have diminished, allowing the tradition to shift toward more historically oriented documentation while retaining the computational frameworks that had originally motivated its compilation. Modern computational analysis of the King List numbers continues to reveal new layers of astronomical sophistication embedded within what appears to be simple chronological documentation. The same mathematical relationships that govern planetary motions and stellar cycles appear encoded within the reign lengths of antediluvian kings, suggesting that ancient Mesopotamian astronomers possessed theoretical understanding of cosmic cycles that modern science has only recently rediscovered through advanced mathematical modeling and computer-assisted calculation. Mesopotamian mythology tells how the god Enki warned the hero Utnapishtim of the coming flood and instructed him to preserve seeds, animals, and craftsmen in his vessel. But some texts suggest Enki also commanded the preservation of written knowledge, tablets and records that would allow civilization to rebuild after the waters receded. Perhaps the King List itself is part of this preserved knowledge, carried through the flood to ensure the memory of the antediluvian world would not be lost. The figure of Enki emerges from Mesopotamian texts not merely as a deity of water and wisdom, but as the divine patron of knowledge preservation, the cosmic librarian who understood that civilizations could be rebuilt from ruins if their essential wisdom survived catastrophic destruction. In the epic accounts of the Great Flood, Enki's instructions to Utnapishtim extend far beyond the simple preservation of biological specimens. They encompass the systematic salvation of human knowledge itself, ensuring that the accumulated wisdom of tens of thousands of years would not perish beneath the rising waters. The Sumerian text known as the Instructions of Shuruppak presents Enki as commanding the preservation of the Tablets of Destinies, the written records that contained not just administrative information but the fundamental principles by which civilized society operated. These weren't simply historical documents, but operational manuals for maintaining complex urban civilization, instructions for irrigation management, architectural techniques, legal precedents, religious rituals, and astronomical observations that have been refined across geological time periods. Archaeological discoveries have revealed that ancient Mesopotamian libraries were systematically organized according to sophisticated cataloging principles, with backup copies of important texts stored in multiple locations to prevent total loss during wars, fires, or natural disasters. The famous library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh contained over 30,000 tablets, many of which were explicitly identified as copies of much older texts that the royal scribes were working to preserve for posterity. This institutional commitment to knowledge preservation suggests that the Mesopotamian understanding of Enki's flood instructions had been implemented as practical policy across centuries. The King List itself bears the characteristics of a document designed for preservation across catastrophic disruption. Its systematic organization, its precise numerical data, its careful genealogical structure, all of these features suggest compilation according to principles that would maximize the chances of accurate transmission through periods of social upheaval. The multiple versions discovered at different sites indicate that copies were distributed across the Mesopotamian world, ensuring that no single catastrophe could eliminate the record entirely. Religious texts describe Enki's preservation project as encompassing not just written documents, but living knowledge, the craftsmen and specialists whose skills would be essential for rebuilding complex civilization after the flood. The Epic of Gilgamesh mentions that Utnapishtim's vessel carried not only family members and animals, but also artisans of all kinds, people whose technical knowledge would be irreplaceable in the post-flood world. This emphasis on preserving human expertise alongside written records suggests understanding that knowledge exists not just in documents, but in the minds and hands of skilled practitioners. The tradition of Enki's knowledge preservation may explain the mysterious speed with which complex civilization reappeared in post-flood Mesopotamia. If systematic efforts had been made to preserve both written records and skilled practitioners, the survivors would have possessed the resources needed to rebuild sophisticated urban societies within relatively short periods. The apparent suddenness of post-flood civilizational recovery becomes comprehensible if viewed not as spontaneous development, but as systematic reconstruction according to preserved blueprints. Cuneiform texts from across Mesopotamian history contain references to ancient tablets and records of the beginning time that were consulted by later scribes seeking to understand proper procedures for temple construction, royal ceremonies, and administrative practices. These references suggest that the knowledge preservation project attributed to Enki had been successfully implemented, creating archives of antediluvian wisdom that continued to influence Mesopotamian civilization across millennia. The mathematical and astronomical sophistication evident in early Mesopotamian texts supports the hypothesis that complex knowledge systems had been systematically preserved through the flood boundary. The sudden appearance of accurate calendar systems, eclipse prediction methods, and sophisticated mathematical techniques in the earliest post-flood texts suggests access to knowledge bases that have been compiled across much longer periods than conventional chronology allows. Modern archaeological techniques have begun to reveal evidence of deliberate knowledge preservation at ancient sites. Tablet caches buried beneath temple foundations, duplicate copies of important text stored in separate locations, and systematic copying projects that created multiple versions of crucial documents all point to conscious efforts to ensure that essential knowledge would survive catastrophic disruption. The King List may represent the most successful example of such preservation, maintaining across millennia the chronological framework that connected post-flood civilization to its antediluvian origins. Mesopotamian tradition speaks of the Apkallu, 7 sages who brought civilization to humanity in the time before the flood. These were not mortal men, but divine or semi-divine beings who taught arts, sciences, and the principles of kingship to the early rulers. After the flood, their wisdom was preserved in written form, allowing the rebuilding of civilization according to antediluvian patterns. The impossibly wise and long-lived kings of the King List may be remembering these original teacher rulers. The Apkallu occupy a unique position in Mesopotamian tradition, serving as the bridge between divine knowledge and human civilization. The intermediaries who translated cosmic wisdom into practical techniques that mortal populations could understand and implement. Their role wasn't simply educational, but foundational. They didn't just teach existing humans about civilization, but actually created the conditions that made civilized life possible, establishing the patterns and principles that would govern human society throughout its subsequent development. Berossus preserves the most detailed account of the Apkallu, describing them as fish-like beings who emerged from the waters of the Persian Gulf during the day to teach humanity various arts and sciences, then return to the sea each evening. Their appearance combined human and aquatic characteristics, suggesting their role as mediators between the watery chaos from which civilization emerged and the ordered terrestrial realm where human society would flourish. Their daily rhythm of emergence and withdrawal parallels the cosmic cycles that governed antediluvian time, connecting their teaching activities to the vast temporal frameworks within which the first kings ruled. The specific knowledge attributed to the Apkallu encompasses all the fundamental technologies and social institutions that distinguish civilization from barbarism. They taught agriculture and irrigation, metallurgy and construction, writing and mathematics, law and government, astronomy and calendar making. But most significantly for understanding the King List, they taught the principles of kingship itself, how divine authority could be channeled through human rulers, how cosmic order could be maintained through terrestrial government, how the vast timescales of celestial cycles could be reflected in the extended lifespans of earthly monarchs. Archaeological evidence supports the tradition of the Apkallu as bearers of advanced knowledge that appeared suddenly in human societies. The sophistication of early Mesopotamian irrigation systems, the precision of their astronomical observations, the complexity of their administrative organizations, all suggest access to knowledge bases that had been developed over much longer periods than the conventional chronology of human development allows. If the Apkallu represent cultural memory of actual historical figures who possessed such advanced knowledge, their role in establishing antediluvian civilization becomes comprehensible. The 7 Apkallu correspond to the 7 antediluvian cities mentioned in various versions of the King List, suggesting that each served as the divine patron and teacher of a particular urban centre. This distribution of cosmic wisdom across multiple sites would have ensured that no single catastrophe could eliminate all traces of civilizational knowledge, creating redundancy in the preservation system that would maximize the chances of successful reconstruction after the flood. Post-flood Mesopotamian texts frequently reference the wisdom of the Apkallu as the source of various technical and administrative practices, indicating that their teachings continued to influence civilization long after the flood had separated the antediluvian world from the historical period. Temple construction rituals, royal coronation ceremonies, and legal precedents were all justified by reference to patterns established by the seven sages, suggesting that their role extended beyond initial instruction to ongoing guidance across the millennia. The transformation of the Apkallu from living teachers to textual authorities reflects the transition from direct divine instruction to written knowledge preservation that characterizes the post-flood world. Where the antediluvian kings had access to immediate counsel from immortal sages, their post-flood successors had to rely on written records and traditional interpretations of ancient wisdom. This shift from personal to institutional knowledge transmission may explain the gradual shortening of royal lifespans recorded in the King List. As direct access to divine wisdom decreased, human rulers became more subject to normal mortal limitations. The tradition of the Apkallu provides crucial context for understanding the impossible achievements attributed to antediluvian rulers. If the first kings were not struggling to develop civilization from primitive beginnings, but were implementing programs designed by immortal teachers who understood cosmic principles, their extraordinary lifespans and accomplishments become expressions of their role as earthly representatives of divine knowledge rather than anomalous individual characteristics requiring special explanation. Modern scholars studying the Apkallu tradition have noted its parallels to similar figures in other ancient cultures, divine teachers who appear at crucial moments to establish civilization and then withdraw, leaving behind written instructions and institutional structures that guide subsequent human development. The global distribution of culture hero traditions suggests that the Mesopotamian accounts preserve authentic memories of actual historical processes rather than purely mythological constructions. If we take the King List seriously as historical document rather than myth, when would the Great Flood have occurred? Adding up the reigns of the 8 antediluvian kings yields more than 200,000 years, a time scale that stretches back into the Pleistocene epoch. Yet archaeological evidence suggests the flood layers in Mesopotamian sites date to around 3000 BCE or slightly earlier, implying that the vast chronologies in the King List operate according to a different understanding of time itself. This chronological puzzle represents one of the most challenging aspects of interpreting the King List as historical document. If we accept the reign lengths at face value and add them sequentially, Alulim's coronation would have occurred sometime around 243,000 BCE, placing the beginning of human kingship deep within the Middle Pleistocene, when ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere and sea levels stood hundreds of feet below their current position. Such a chronology would imply that sophisticated human civilization existed during geological periods when conventional archaeology finds only scattered populations of archaic humans using stone tools. Yet the archaeological evidence for catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia points consistently to much more recent dates, clustering around the period between 4000 and 3000 BCE, when rising sea levels and changing climate patterns created conditions for massive riverine inundations. The flood layers discovered at Kish, Shuruppak and other sites all date to this relatively recent period, suggesting that the great catastrophe remembered in the King List occurred within the time frame of conventional human history rather than the vast epochs implied by antediluvian chronology. Several interpretations have been proposed to reconcile these contradictory timescales. Some scholars suggest that the antediluvian numbers represent not sequential years but overlapping cycles, with different kings ruling simultaneously in different regions rather than in chronological succession. Others propose that the vast numbers encode astronomical or calendrical information rather than literal lifespans, with each year of royal rule representing some larger temporal unit, perhaps lunar months, seasonal cycles, or even precessional periods lasting multiple centuries. The possibility that antediluvian chronology operates according to different temporal principles than post-flood history finds support in the gradual transition from impossible to merely extraordinary lifespans recorded in the King List itself. The systematic reduction in royal longevity across successive dynasties suggests not arbitrary editing, but reflection of changing conditions that affected how time was experienced and measured in different historical periods. Geological evidence complicates the chronological picture further. While the flood layers at Mesopotamian sites date to the 4th millennium BCE, evidence of much earlier catastrophic flooding appears in marine sediment cores and coastal archaeological sites that are now submerged. If human societies had developed complex civilizations in coastal areas that are now underwater due to post-glacial sea level rise, the King List might preserve memories of both the original antediluvian period, stretching back tens of thousands of years, and the final catastrophic flooding that forced the last survivors inland to establish the historical Mesopotamian cities. Recent discoveries in underwater archaeology have begun to reveal submerged settlements and structures that date to much earlier periods than previously expected, suggesting that complex human societies may indeed have existed during time periods that correspond more closely to the vast chronologies implied by antediluvian king lists. Sites like Dwarka off the coast of India, underwater structures near Japan, and submerged settlements in the Mediterranean all point to sophisticated civilizations that flourished during periods of lower sea level and were subsequently inundated by rising waters. The relationship between astronomical cycles and the antediluvian chronology offers another possible resolution to the temporal puzzle. If the impossible rain lengths encode precessional cycles, planetary periods, or other long-term celestial phenomena, the King List might represent a sophisticated astronomical calendar that tracks cosmic time rather than terrestrial history. In this interpretation, the reigns of antediluvian kings become temporal markers within vast astronomical cycles, while the flood represents not a singular historical event but a regular transition point between cosmic ages that occurs according to predictable celestial schedules. The precision with which impossible numbers are preserved in the King List suggests that they possess specific significance that transcended mere chronological record-keeping. The mathematical relationships between different reign lengths, their correspondence to known astronomical cycles, and their systematic reduction in the post-flood period all point to underlying principles of temporal measurement that operated according to cosmic rather than purely terrestrial frameworks. Modern attempts to correlate King List chronology with archaeological evidence continue to yield new insights into how ancient civilizations understood the relationship between human history and cosmic time. The same cultures that could predict eclipses centuries in advance and track planetary positions with mathematical precision were certainly capable of maintaining chronological systems that operated across timescales far beyond individual human experience. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Sumerian King List is not its impossible numbers, but its persistence across millennia. Even when the tradition was copied and recopied by scribes who lived in a world of normal human lifespans, They faithfully preserved the ancient claim that once, in the beginning, time moved differently, and kings ruled for ages that now seem mythical. Something in that memory was too important to lose, too fundamental to edit into believable proportions. The faithful transmission of impossible chronologies across centuries of copying represents one of the most striking examples of cultural fidelity in the ancient world. Mesopotamian scribes possessed sophisticated editorial capabilities. They regularly updated obsolete terminology, corrected obvious errors, and adapted ancient texts for contemporary audiences. Yet when confronting the antediluvian sections of the King List, these same scribes who felt free to modify other aspects of the tradition preserved with meticulous care numerical claims that must have seemed as incredible to them as they do to modern readers. This preservation wasn't accidental or unconscious, but represented deliberate choice by scholarly communities that understood they were maintaining knowledge whose significance transcended immediate comprehensibility. The scribal schools of ancient Mesopotamia trained their students in critical evaluation of textual sources, teaching them to distinguish between reliable and unreliable information, between historical fact and mythological embellishment. Their decision to preserve the impossible reign lengths without modification suggests conviction that these numbers possessed importance that justified their retention despite their apparent implausibility. The institutional continuity required for such faithful preservation across millennia reveals something profound about Mesopotamian civilization's relationship to its own past. Unlike many cultures that allowed ancient traditions to evolve gradually through retelling, losing precision in favor of contemporary relevance, Mesopotamian society developed sophisticated mechanisms for preserving exact knowledge across vast time periods. The same institutional structures that maintained astronomical observations and mathematical calculations across centuries also ensured that chronological claims reaching back to the very beginning of time would be transmitted without corruption. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the extraordinary care with which Mesopotamian scribes approached their responsibilities as guardians of ancient knowledge. Tablet libraries contained not just single copies of important texts, but multiple versions that could be compared for accuracy. Colophons, scribal notes added at the end of tablets, often specify that texts had been collated with ancient exemplars to ensure faithful reproduction. Some tablets bear certifications that they had been checked against the original in temple archives, indicating systematic quality control in the copying process. The motivation for such careful preservation may have stemmed from understanding that the antediluvian chronologies encoded information that would become comprehensible only when human knowledge had advanced sufficiently to interpret their true significance. Mesopotamian texts frequently reference knowledge that was hidden for the wise or sealed until the appointed time, suggesting awareness that some forms of understanding required cultural development that might not occur for centuries or millennia. The mathematical relationships embedded within the seemingly impossible numbers provide evidence that the King List compilers understood they were preserving sophisticated intellectual content rather than simple historical claims. The correspondence between antediluvian reign lengths and known astronomical cycles, the systematic patterns in their numerical relationships, the precise reduction ratios that characterize the transition to post-flood chronology, all suggest underlying mathematical principles that were deliberately encoded within the chronological framework. Religious motivations may also have contributed to the faithful preservation of antediluvian traditions. If the impossible rain lengths were understood as reflecting divine rather than merely human timescales, then altering them would have constituted theological rather than historical error. The same reverence that prevented scribes from modifying sacred liturgical texts may have extended to chronological records that connected the historical world to its divine origins. The persistence of King List traditions through the political upheavals that regularly disrupted Mesopotamian civilization demonstrates their fundamental importance to cultural identity and continuity. Even when dynasties changed, cities were destroyed, and populations were displaced, the essential chronological framework that linked contemporary rulers to the first kings who had ever ruled remained intact. This suggests that the King List served not just as historical record, but as constitutional document that legitimized the entire institution of kingship by demonstrating its cosmic origins and antediluvian precedents. Modern scholars studying the transmission history of ancient texts continue to be amazed by the consistency with which impossible chronology appear across different versions of the King List discovered at sites separated by centuries and hundreds of miles. This consistency required active maintenance by scholarly communities that understood themselves as guardians of knowledge too important to allow corruption through casual transmission. As we near the end of our journey through the impossible reigns of antediluvian kings, the deepest mystery remains unsolved. Was the King List preserving literal historical truth about a lost age when human life operated according to different laws? Was it encoding astronomical or calendrical knowledge in the form of royal chronology? Or was it attempting to preserve something even more fundamental, the memory of humanity's true antiquity, stretching back not thousands but hundreds of thousands of years into a past we've barely begun to understand? The question that haunts every careful study of the Sumerian King List is whether we are confronting the remnants of genuine historical memory or the sophisticated intellectual constructions of ancient scholars who encoded complex knowledge within narrative frameworks designed to ensure its preservation across vast time periods. Both interpretations find support in the evidence, yet neither fully explains the extraordinary persistence and precision with which these impossible claims have been maintained across millennia of cultural transmission. If the King List preserves literal historical memory, it implies that human civilization possesses an antiquity and sophistication that challenges fundamental assumptions about the development of complex societies. The archaeological record would then represent not the gradual emergence of civilization from primitive beginnings, but the recent recovery of knowledge and capabilities that had been developed across geological time periods and temporarily lost through catastrophic disruption. The impossibly long lifespans of antediluvian rulers would reflect actual biological or metaphysical conditions that once prevailed, but have since been altered by cosmic forces beyond current scientific understanding. The astronomical interpretation suggests that ancient Mesopotamian scholars developed sophisticated methods for encoding calendrical and mathematical knowledge within memorable narrative structures, using royal genealogies as computational frameworks for tracking celestial cycles across vast time periods. In this reading, the King List becomes one of humanity's earliest and most successful attempts at creating intellectual technology capable of preserving complex knowledge systems across the social disruptions that regularly threaten cultural continuity. The precision of the mathematical relationships embedded within antediluvian chronologies supports this interpretation, suggesting systematic encoding of temporal knowledge that operated according to cosmic rather than biographical principles. Yet perhaps the deepest possibility is that the King List preserves something more fundamental than either literal history or astronomical calculation: the intuitive understanding that human consciousness itself partakes of temporal scales far vaster than individual biological existence. The impossible reign lengths might represent not false claims about individual lifespans, but accurate insights into the true scope of human cultural memory, which stretches back through accumulated collective experience across time periods that dwarf the brief spans of individual lives. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to push back the horizons of human antiquity and sophistication, revealing capabilities and achievements at time periods when conventional theory expects only primitive hunter-gatherer societies. Sites like Göbekli Tepe, with its massive stone circles dating to 10,000 BCE, demonstrate that complex organized societies existed far earlier than previously believed. Underwater archaeology has revealed submerged settlements and structures that date to periods when sea levels were much lower, suggesting that sophisticated civilizations may have developed in coastal areas that are now hidden beneath hundreds of feet of water. The possibility that human societies have undergone multiple cycles of development and catastrophic regression finds support in geological evidence for periodic environmental disasters of sufficient magnitude to disrupt global civilization. Volcanic super-eruptions, asteroid impacts, massive climate shifts and other natural catastrophes have occurred throughout human history on scales capable of forcing technological societies back to subsistence levels, creating the conditions under which sophisticated knowledge could be lost and laboriously rediscovered across multiple cycles. Perhaps the Sumerian King List preserves institutional memory of such cycles, maintaining awareness that current civilization represents not humanity's first attempt at complex society, but its most recent recovery from catastrophic regression. The antediluvian kings might then represent not individuals but entire epochs of civilizational development, their impossible lifespans encoding the vast time periods required for societies to develop from primitive beginnings to the sophisticated levels implied by early Mesopotamian achievements. The mathematical precision with which these temporal memories have been preserved suggests that whatever the King List actually records, its compilers understood themselves to be maintaining knowledge of fundamental importance to human understanding of our place in cosmic time, whether that knowledge concerns literal historical events, astronomical relationships, or metaphysical insights into the nature of consciousness and temporality. Its preservation across millennia represents one of humanity's most remarkable achievements in cultural transmission. As you drift towards sleep, somewhere in the space between dream and memory, perhaps you can sense the presence of those ancient scribes working by lamplight, pressing into wet clay the chronological mysteries that would challenge human understanding across all the centuries to come. Their cuneiform marks still hold questions we're only beginning to formulate, preserving in mathematical precision the record of times when human existence touched the edges of eternity, and kings ruled not for years but for ages that stretched toward the infinite horizon of cosmic time. The deepest mystery of the Sumerian King List may not be what it remembers, but what it teaches us about memory itself, how consciousness can stretch across time periods that transcend individual existence, connecting us through institutional and cultural continuity to knowledge and experiences that reach back through the mists of time to the very beginning, when kingship first descended from heaven and human civilization took its first breath in the ancient light of dawn. And so tonight, as you rest beneath the same stars that once guided those impossibly long-lived kings through their geological reigns, consider how the mystery endures. The clay tablets that preserve their names rest now in climate-controlled museum cases, behind protective glass, their cuneiform marks still holding questions we're only beginning to answer. But perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some knowledge is meant to wait, patient as stone, until the moment we're ready to understand what our ancestors were truly saying. The scribes who carved those records into wet clay by lamplight 5,000 years ago were reaching across time toward you, preserving memories they knew would outlive their own civilization, their own understanding, their own world. They couldn't have imagined electric lights or computer screens, yet somehow they knew that in some distant future, curious minds would hunger for connection to the deep past, would seek to understand how human consciousness emerged from the mists of time to create cities and kingdoms, and impossible stories of rulers who governed for eternity. Tonight, you're part of that same human story. The endless quest to understand where we came from and what it means to be human in a universe vast beyond comprehension. Whether Alulim truly ruled for 28,800 years, or whether his impossible reign encodes astronomical secrets we've forgotten, the deeper truth remains. We're connected across time to ancestors who looked up at night sky and wondered, just as you do now, about our place in the cosmic order. The antediluvian world sleeps beneath layers of sand and silt, but its memory lives on in the questions that still stir human hearts. What did we know once that we've forgotten? What forms of existence were once possible that seem impossible now? How long does consciousness endure, and what connections transcend the boundaries of individual life? Let yourself drift now into that vast river of time where the distinction between myth and memory dissolves like salt in ancient waters. You're connected to those first kings and their impossible lifespans, to the scribes who preserved their memory, to all the generations who've wondered at the mystery of deep time and human antiquity. Rest now in that timeless place where questions matter more than answers, where wonder trumps certainty, and where the ancient world still whispers its secrets to those who know how to listen in the dark. Sleep well. The mystery will be here when you wake.